What would you do if the family that was meant to care for you instead cast you out with an inheritance designed to break you? For the sum of £3, a pittance required by law, they gave a young widow the deed to a place no one had dared to live in for half a century, a crumbling manor that was more ruin than residence. They laughed as she took it, her pale face a mask of grief and resolve, certain she would be begging on the parish steps before the first frost. But the truth waiting inside those collapsing walls, buried behind a century of neglect and sealed away by a forgotten promise, was a secret of astonishing value. Settle in and let us travel back to the damp lanes of 1860s Shropshire, to a story of quiet defiance and the remarkable discovery at Ashford Grange. Margaret Hale arrived in the village of Wrenby on the back of a carrier's cart, a single wooden trunk holding all that remained of her life. She was 21 years old, a widow of 4 months, and her husband, Thomas's family, had made their position clear. The cart rattled to a stop in the muddy square, and the driver, a man with a face like a worn leather purse, gestured with his thumb toward the inn. The Gilded Fox, best ale in the county, though that's not saying much. Margaret paid him the last of her coins and watched him go, feeling the weight of 100 gazes from behind twitching lace curtains. She stood alone, a slight figure in a plain black dress, her worn boots sinking into the wet earth. The air smelled of coal smoke and rain-soaked wool. Her silent companion, an old lurcher named Bramble who had been Thomas's shadow, pressed his gray muzzle into her hand, a warm, solid presence in the cold afternoon. Her brother-in-law, Arthur Hale, had presented the deed with a flourish of false magnanimity in the solicitor's overheated London office. "Ashford Grange," he had announced, his voice booming with a cruel cheerfulness. "The original family seat, been empty a good while, needs a woman's touch. We feel it's only right that Thomas's wife should have a piece of his heritage." His wife, a woman of sharp angles and sharper glances, had smirked behind her fan. The solicitor, a man paid for his silence, had merely coughed and slid the papers across the polished desk. Margaret remembered the feel of the dry parchment, the spidery ink that signed away her last connection to the Hales and gave her ownership of a place she had never seen. £3. The price of a good pig, her father would have said. It was the price of her exile. She had signed without a word, her hand steady, her grief a cold, hard stone in her chest. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. Now, standing in the heart of Wrenby, that distant act of cruelty became a stark and present reality. The villagers stared, their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They knew who she was. News traveled faster than a horse in these parts, carried on the wind from one parish to another. She was the London girl, the widow Hale, the fool who had accepted the Grange. The weight of their judgment was a physical thing, pressing down on her shoulders. She pulled her thin shawl tighter, lifted her chin, and began the long walk toward the lane that was said to lead to her new and likely final home. The path to Ashford Grange was less a lane and more a suggestion, a green tunnel carved between overgrown hedgerows thick with hawthorn and ivy. Bramble trotted ahead, his tail low, sniffing the unfamiliar scents with a quiet anxiety that mirrored her own. After a mile, the lane opened, and she saw it for the first time, silhouetted against a bruised purple sky. The Grange was not a house. It was a ghost. A 3-story mass of gray stone, it slumped against the hillside as if exhausted. Slate tiles had slid from the roof in a cascade of decay, leaving skeletal timbers exposed to the elements. Windows, like vacant eyes, were either boarded over or shattered, the remaining shards of glass glinting faintly in the dying light. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, crawled over the facade, pulling stones loose and masking the building's original lines. A great stone chimney on the east wing had partially collapsed, its rubble strewn across what might have once been a lawn. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and rot. It was a place of profound and utter neglect, a monument to forgotten things. For a moment, her resolve faltered. The Hales had not just given her a ruin. They had given her a tomb. They had sent her here to be buried by the sheer weight of its decay. Bramble whimpered softly beside her, and she rested a hand on his head, his rough fur a comfort. The house was a challenge, a final insult from a family that had never wanted her. Very well, she thought. Let them watch. She would not break, not yet. She would face the ruin, and she would endure it. The open loop of her future was a terrifying, empty space, but it was hers alone. The only person from her old life who had offered any kindness was a tenant farmer from her father's parish, a man named Mr. Finch. He had appeared at her London lodging the day before she left, his face etched with concern. "It's not right, Margaret," he had said, his voice a low rumble. "Sending you off to a place like that." He had pressed a small, heavy purse into her hand. "It's not much, but it'll see you through the first weeks." And he had arranged for the carrier's cart, insisting on paying the fare himself. Now she wished for his steady presence, for his simple, uncomplicated decency. But she was alone. She approached the great oak door of the grange, its wood bleached silver and split by years of sun and rain. The iron handle was rusted solid. She pushed, putting her whole weight against it, but it wouldn't budge. Defeated, she circled the house, her boots squelching in the marshy ground. She found a low, broken window leading into what might have been a scullery. It was her only way in. With a deep breath, she hitched up her skirts, covered the jagged glass with her shawl, and climbed through. She landed on a floor slick with damp moss, the air inside even colder and more stagnant than without. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of water from the ceiling. This was her inheritance, a crumbling, water-logged shell filled with shadows and the ghosts of a life long since extinguished. She spent that first night not in the grand, decaying rooms, but huddled with Bramble in a small, dry corner of an adjoining stable, a space that smelled of hay and earth. The great house loomed beside her in the darkness, a sleeping giant she was not yet brave enough to wake. What does a person do when faced with a challenge so immense it threatens to swallow them whole? How do you begin to repair a place that seems determined to fall down around you? Is it foolishness to try, or is it the only true way to begin living again? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Margaret's place, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage. For as the first light of dawn touched the broken roof of Ashford Grange, Margaret Hale was about to discover that the house was not entirely dead, and that its deepest secrets were kept under lock and key. Her first foray into Renby for supplies was an ordeal of quiet humiliation. She walked the 2 miles back to the village square, a list clutched in her hand. Flour, salt, candles, a bar of soap. The whispers followed her like a cloud of gnats as she moved from the baker to the general store. Faces turned away as she approached. Conversations died in her presence. They were not unkind, not precisely, but they treated her as one already lost, a ghost haunting the edges of their prosperous, ordinary lives. As she stood counting her few remaining coins to pay the shopkeeper, A loud, familiar voice cut through the low murmur of the store. "Well, well, the lady of the manor comes to town." Arthur Hale stood in the doorway, blocking the light. He was dressed in a fine tweed coat, his face ruddy with good living. He had come, she knew, to witness her failure, to gather the story of her defeat to share back in London. "How do you find your new estate, Margaret?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "A bit of a fixer-upper, I imagine." The other patrons in the shop fell silent, their eyes darting between them. Margaret felt a hot flush of anger rise in her cheeks, but she pushed it down. She met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. "It is quiet," she said, her voice steady. "And it is mine." Arthur let out a great bark of laughter. "Yours. It belongs to the crows and the ivy, my dear. You'll be back in London with your tail between your legs by Christmas, mark my words." He swept a mocking bow and departed, leaving a wake of snickers behind him. Margaret finished her transaction, her hands trembling slightly, and fled the shop, the shame burning like a brand. She sat on a cold stone bench in the churchyard to compose herself, Bramble resting his head on her knee. The grey stone of the ancient church felt solid and reassuring. An old woman, her back bent like a question mark, was tending to a nearby grave, methodically pulling weeds with gnarled fingers. The woman eventually straightened up, wincing, and her eyes, pale and cloudy as a winter sky, fell on Margaret. She did not offer pity or scorn, only a long, searching look. "You're the one at the Grange," the woman stated, her voice thin and reedy, like the wind through dry reeds. Margaret simply nodded. The old woman, who Margaret would later learn was Mrs. Gable, a widow herself for 50 years, took a slow step closer. "They say it's a lost cause," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the distant, brooding shape of the manor on the hill. "They say the house is dead." She paused, and then added a line that would echo in Margaret's mind for weeks to come. "But some houses remember what men forget." Without another word, she turned and shuffled away, disappearing among the tilting headstones. Margaret sat with the strange pronouncement, the words seeming to hang in the damp air. What could a house remember? And what had the men who lived there forgotten? The cryptic remark was a splinter in her mind, a puzzle she could not yet solve. She rose, gathered her meager supplies, and with Bramble at her heel, began the long walk back to the Grange, her heart a little less heavy, her resolve hardened by the twin spurs of mockery and mystery. The next morning, Margaret resolved to truly enter the house. She could not live in the stables forever. Using a rusted iron bar she'd found, she pried open the main doors, which groaned in protest, surrendering with a loud crack of splintering wood. A cloud of dust motes, disturbed for the first time in decades, danced in the single shaft of sunlight that pierced the grime-caked windows of the great hall. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a cloying mix of damp plaster, rotting wood, and something else, something faintly floral, like pressed flowers that had long since turned to dust. The scale of the ruin within was even more daunting than it had appeared from the outside. A grand staircase, its balustrade half-eaten by woodworm, rose into the gloom of the upper floors. Furniture lay in disarray, draped in thick, velvety shrouds of cobwebs. A portrait of a stern-faced man in a powdered wig hung askew, his painted eyes seeming to follow her as she moved. She walked slowly through the ground-floor rooms, her footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The drawing room, the dining room, the morning room, each was a scene of slow, inexorable collapse. Wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, revealing damp, blackened plaster beneath. A pianoforte stood in one corner, its keys yellowed and silent, its legs sinking into a patch of rotten floorboards. It was a place that actively resisted life, that seemed to want only to be left alone to crumble back into the earth. Despair, cold and sharp, pricked at her. Arthur was right. This was a fool's errand. This was not a home. It was a grave. She was about to retreat, to flee back to the relative comfort of the stable, when she noticed a smaller, sturdier-looking door tucked away beneath the main staircase. It led to what must have been the servants' quarters. Here, the decay was less absolute. The room was small, with a stone-flagged floor, a large fireplace black with soot, and a single, small window that looked out onto a walled garden, now a riot of weeds and thorns. The air was still cold, but it felt cleaner, less haunted. A simple wooden table and a single chair stood in the center of the room. This, she thought, was manageable. This was a space she could claim. Over the next few days, she focused all her energy on this one room. She swept away the layers of dust and grime, scrubbed the stone floor with water hauled from a well in the courtyard, and cleared the fireplace of old birds' nests and fallen soot. She used her trunk as a makeshift bed, her shawl as a blanket. On the third evening, she built her first fire. The dry wood crackled and spat, and as the flames caught, a warm, golden light pushed back the shadows. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. That night, for the first time, she slept inside the walls of Ashford Grange, with Bramble curled on a piece of old sacking by the hearth. As she drifted off to sleep, she heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound from somewhere deep within the house. She told herself it was just the wind, or a loose shutter, but the sound was too regular, too deliberate to be easily dismissed. Weeks turned into a month. Margaret established a routine born of necessity. Mornings were for gathering firewood from the overgrown woodland behind the house. Afternoons for the slow, arduous work of making the west wing habitable. She was consumed by labor, a physical exertion that quieted the grief in her mind. She patched the leaking scullery roof with slates she salvaged from the collapsed stable. She painstakingly reglazed a window with a piece of glass she'd bought in the village, learning the craft from a book she'd discovered, its pages stiff with damp, in a small study off the main hall. The villagers, seeing her persist, began to accord her a grudging respect. The whispers did not cease, but their tone shifted from mockery to a kind of bewildered admiration. The baker would now add an extra loaf to her order. For the dog, he'd mutter, avoiding her eyes. She worked her way through the ground floor of the west wing, room by room, clearing away the debris of a generation. It was in the library that she found the first true anomaly. The room was a wreck, its shelves collapsed, its books a moldering pulp on the floor. But one section of shelving, a tall, narrow bookcase built into the wall between two windows, stood pristine. While everything around it was coated in a thick, gray blanket of dust and draped in cobwebs, this single bookcase was clean. The dark wood shone with a faint luster, as if it had been polished not long ago. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface. There was no dust, no grime. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of lemon oil and beeswax clung to the wood. It made no sense. The rest of the house had been abandoned to the elements for 50 years. Who would have tended to this one small spot? She examined the books on its shelves. They were volumes of botany and horticulture, their leather bindings dry but intact. The principles of orchid cultivation, a study of English ferns, the language of flowers. They seemed untouched by the damp that had ruined everything else. For days, the clean bookshelf was a quiet puzzle at the back of her mind. She had more pressing concerns: the coming winter, her dwindling funds, the constant gnawing loneliness. She set the mystery aside, focusing on the practical tasks of survival. But every time she passed through the library, her eyes were drawn to it. It was a single, orderly sentence in a long, rambling paragraph of chaos. It was a detail that refused to fit, a question waiting patiently to be asked. Why this bookcase? Why these books? The house, it seemed, was beginning to speak to her, not in groans and creaks, but in small, insistent whispers of inconsistency. And she, in her quiet, stubborn way, was finally beginning to listen. The first frost of autumn laid a silver filigree over the overgrown gardens of the Grange, a beautiful but urgent reminder of the coming cold. Margaret's small store of coins had dwindled to almost nothing, and the need to make the house truly secure against the winter pressed upon her. Her work became more focused, a race against the shortening days. It was this urgency that drove her back to the library, back to the strange, clean bookshelf. She could not shake the feeling that it held some significance, that Mrs. Gable's words about the house remembering were tied to this peculiar spot. One afternoon, with the low sun slanting through the dusty windows, she decided to investigate properly. With Bramble watching from the doorway, his amber eyes following her every move, she began to remove the books from the shelves one by one. She handled them carefully, placing them in neat stacks on the floor. As she lifted the last volume from the bottom shelf, her fingers brushed against the wooden back panel of the bookcase. A faint, cool draft touched her skin. She pressed gently. The panel felt thin, and it vibrated slightly, confirming her suspicion. There was a space behind it. The rhythmic tapping she'd heard on her first night. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of a loose panel moving in the draft from a hidden cavity. A thrill, a mixture of fear and excitement, ran through her. This was not random decay. This was deliberate. This was a secret. She needed a tool, something to pry the panel away from its frame. Her mind went to the small wooden box Mr. Finch had insisted she take, the one containing a few of Thomas's personal effects. She had not opened it since his death. The pain was too near. Now, with a specific purpose, she could face it. She carried the box to the library and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst his shaving brush, a worn copy of Shakespeare, and a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, was a set of small carpentry tools he had used for his hobby of carving wooden birds. Among them was a flat, sturdy pry bar. Her throat tightened. It felt as if he were here, helping her. Holding the cool, familiar weight of the steel in her hand gave her strength. She returned to the bookcase and carefully inserted the tip of the pry bar into the fine seam between the back panel and the frame. She leveraged it gently. The old wood groaned in protest. She applied more pressure, and with a sharp crack, a corner of the panel splintered and came free. She worked her way around the edges, the sound of her efforts loud in the silent house. Finally, the panel gave way entirely, revealing not a hidden room, but a small, dark, brick-lined cavity. And resting inside, on a small wooden shelf, was a single object. A thick, leather-bound ledger, its cover embossed with the initials SC. The light was fading fast. Margaret carried the ledger back to her small, reclaimed room as if it were a holy relic. She lit 2 extra candles, their combined flames casting a flickering, insufficient glow over the worn leather cover. Bramble, sensing the gravity of the moment, rose from his spot by the fire and came to lay his head on her lap, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm in the quiet room. Her hands trembled as she opened the book. The paper was thick and of high quality, The ink a faded brown, the handwriting an elegant looping script. The first page was dated May 12th, 1840. The entry began, "My sons, I fear, see only the land. They see the fields as revenue, the woods as timber, the house as a monument to their own status. They do not see the life that it holds." The journal belonged to Silas Croft, the last master of Ashford Grange, the man who had built the East Wing and whose portrait hung askew in the great hall. He was, she learned as she turned the pages, a passionate and gifted botanist. The ledger was not a record of accounts or estate matters, but a detailed, obsessive chronicle of his life's work, the cultivation of orchids. He wrote of expeditions to the jungles of the Far East, of the delicate art of cross-pollination, of his decades-long quest to create a flower of unparalleled beauty. And he had succeeded. He described his greatest achievement, a unique hybrid he had named Phalaenopsis ashfordensis, the Ashford orchid. It was, he wrote, the color of a winter dawn, with petals of the palest lilac veined with silver and a scent like honey and rain. It was his masterpiece, the culmination of his existence. But his joy was soured by a growing fear. His sons, whom he described as men of brutal practicality and no soul, saw his passion as a foolish extravagance. They had spoken of selling his collection to the highest bidder upon his death. Silas Croft could not bear the thought of his life's work being scattered and commodified, and so, in the final years of his life, he had devised a plan. The entries from 1841 became furtive, filled with descriptions of brick and mortar, of reinforced doors and sealed flues. He was converting the entire East Wing, with its vast glass conservatory, into a sanctuary, a self-sustaining ark for his precious orchids. He would hide them in plain sight, sealing them away where no one would think to look. The final entry was dated October 3rd, 1841. "The work is done. The wing is sealed. They will think it is merely a structural repair, a precaution against the failing chimney. They will never know what sleeps inside. I have left only one key, for a day when someone with a gentler hand and a quieter heart might find this place again. Let them be the keeper of my dawns." At the bottom of the page was a small, intricate drawing of the ledger itself, with an arrow pointing to the thick spine. With a surge of understanding, Margaret took a small paring knife from her pocket and carefully, reverently, sliced open the leather binding. Something hard and cool fell into her waiting palm. It was a small, ornate key of blackened iron. Before Margaret could even contemplate using the key, the sky, which had been a sullen gray for days, broke open. A storm of biblical ferocity descended upon Shropshire, lashing the countryside with wind and torrential rain. The wind howled around the corners of the grange, rattling the window frames and shrieking down the chimneys. It was as if the house itself was in agony. The storm became a test of Margaret's stewardship. A section of the patched scullery roof gave way, and icy water poured in. She worked through the night by candlelight, using buckets and old oilcloths to divert the flow. Her dress soaked through, her hands numb with cold. A window in the great hall shattered, and the wind tore through the house, a malevolent force that seemed intent on ripping the old building apart. She dragged a heavy piece of furniture to block the opening, her muscles screaming with the effort. She was no longer just a resident. She was the Grange's defender, fighting to hold its fragile body and soul together. In the deepest hours of the night, at the height of the storm's fury, she heard a frantic pounding at the main door. It was a sound so unexpected, so human, that it shocked her. Bramble let out a low growl. Cautiously, she unbarred the door, holding her lantern high. A man stood on the threshold, drenched and desperate, his face pale with fear. Behind him, a woman was huddled over two small children, trying to shield them from the driving rain. "Please," the man stammered, his teeth chattering. "Our cart. It overturned in the lane. The axle is broken. We saw your light." Without hesitation, Margaret stood aside. Come in, out of the storm." She led the terrified family, the Cartwrights, to her small, warm room. She gave them her dry blankets, stoked the fire until it roared, and shared the last of her bread and cheese and a pot of hot tea. Mrs. Cartwright wept with relief, while her husband could only stare at Margaret with a look of profound gratitude. The youngest child, a girl of no more than 4, was soothed by Bramble, who lay patiently by her side, allowing her to bury her small, cold hands in his thick fur. For that one night, the vast, empty grange was a home again. It was a sanctuary, not just for Margaret, but for a family in need. As the storm raged outside, the small room was an island of warmth and safety. In that moment, Margaret understood something profound. The house was not hers to own, but to care for. Her purpose was not to conquer it, but to serve it. By choosing to shelter these strangers, by offering what little she had passed a crucial test. She had committed herself not to the value the house might hold, but to the life it could protect. The storm broke at dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and silent. The Cartwrights departed soon after, their thanks effusive and sincere. As she watched them go, Margaret felt a sense of peace settle over her. The crisis had passed, and she and the house had endured. The day after the storm was bright and clear, the air crisp with the promise of winter. The world seemed remade. Margaret took the iron key from her pocket, its weight a solid, reassuring presence in her palm. The time had come. She walked through the silent house to the end of the long ground-floor corridor that led to the east wing. As Silas Croft's journal had described, the arched doorway was bricked up, the work crude but effective. A thick layer of plaster, now cracked and discolored with age, had been smeared over the bricks in an attempt to make it look like a solid wall. But set into the wall at waist height was a small, iron-plated door, no bigger than a book, with a keyhole in its center. This was the entrance Silas had designed. She inserted the key. It turned with a rusty, grating sound, the mechanism stiff after decades of disuse. With a loud clunk, the lock released. She pulled the small iron door open, revealing a dark, cavernous space beyond. A wave of cool, humid air, fragrant with the scent of damp earth, moss, and a faint, sweet perfume, washed over her. She fetched her lantern and stepped across the threshold. She was standing in what had once been a magnificent ballroom, but it had been utterly transformed. The far wall was gone, replaced by a vast, curving wall of glass that soared 3 stories high. It was a conservatory of breathtaking scale, a cathedral of light, and it was filled with life. Ranks of wooden tables and tiered shelves held hundreds of clay pots. In them, dormant but clearly alive, were the orchids. Their thick, leathery leaves were a deep, glossy green, beaded with moisture. Though it was not their season to flower, a few stubborn, miraculous blooms punctuated the sea of green. There, on a raised dais in the center of the room, was a cluster of plants bearing flowers the color of a winter dawn, their pale lilac petals veined with a delicate, shimmering silver. Phalaenopsis ashfordensis, the Ashford orchid. It had survived. Silas Croft's secret garden, his hidden legacy, had endured for half a century, sustained by an ingenious system of cisterns and vents that collected rainwater and circulated air. It was a miracle of love and botany. News of the discovery, carried by the grateful Mr. Cartwright, spread through Renby and beyond like wildfire. The story of the widow Hale and her ruin took on a mythic quality. One afternoon, a carriage arrived. It was Mr. Davies, a solicitor from Shrewsbury, a kind, elderly man with a reputation for integrity. He had heard the tale and had come to see for himself. Margaret led him to the east wing. He stopped at the entrance, his mouth agape. He walked slowly through the glass house, touching a leaf here, inhaling a scent there. "My dear Mrs. Hale," he said at last, his voice filled with awe. "Do you have any idea what this is? This is one of the most significant private botanical collections in all of England. Its value, it's incalculable." Arthur Hale arrived a week later, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He saw the glass house, the rows of priceless plants, the quiet dignity with which Margaret moved among them. He saw the villagers who now tipped their hats to her, the tradesmen who offered her credit, the quiet respect in their eyes. He said nothing. He simply turned, his face pale, and walked away, humbled not by any word she had spoken, but by the undeniable truth of what she had found. A year passed. The Grange began to heal under Margaret's care. With the funds provided by the sale of a few of the more common orchids to a botanical society in London, she was able to hire local workmen to repair the roof, replace the broken windows, and restore the crumbling stonework. The house was no longer a ghost, but a place of quiet, purposeful activity. The East Wing remained her sanctuary, a place of warmth and light even on the bleakest winter days. She learned the names and needs of every plant, tending to them with the same patient care Silas Croft had shown. She was no longer Margaret Hale, the poor widow from London. She was the keeper of the Grange, a title whispered with reverence in the village. One soft evening in late spring, as the golden hour light streamed through the conservatory glass, Mr. Finch came to visit. He had made the journey from his farm to see for himself the place that had become a local legend. He walked with her through the fragrant, humid air of the glass house, his weathered face filled with a quiet wonder. He looked at the thriving orchids, at the restored beauty of the house, and then at Margaret, her face calm and confident, her hands stained with good earth. "They gave you a ruin, Margaret," he said, his voice soft, "but you've made a paradise." Margaret smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile. She gently touched the petal of an Ashford orchid, its lilac and silver hues glowing in the evening sun. She thought of the Hales' contempt, of the villagers' mockery, of her own initial despair. And she thought of the patient, brilliant man who had built this place, who had trusted that someone someday would understand. "They didn't give me the ruin," she said quietly, her words holding the entire moral of her journey. "They gave me the key. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this journey. This has been a story about the quiet strength of patience and the idea that true value is often hidden beneath the surface of neglect, waiting for a gentle hand to reveal it. If you found a piece of your own heart in Margaret's story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of hidden treasures and unexpected triumphs. And let us know in the comments what forgotten place you'd love to bring back to life. We'll be back soon with the story of a fisherman's cottage, a lost sea chart, and a secret that lay just beneath the waves. Until then, be well.